Mr. Speaker, and I'm sorry I haven't been in for the whole of the debate, but I've been at the Exiting the European Union Select Committee debating one of our reports, and we have been firmly excising split infinitives and making sure that apostrophes appear in the right place and that umble addresses have the correct indefinite article preceding them and all those important matters, but it took me away from the chamber. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman, the member for Nottingham East, who is always so interesting on these matters, though we disagree very firmly. And I thought it might be worth looking at how much better the figures are than they were expected to be, because in the context of Brexit, we are always told the end of the world is nigh, the writing is on the wall, all will be terrible, and yet when we look at the Red Book, we know that the figures we have had so far are better, in spite of the Treasury and others saying it would all be a disaster. So, 136, borrowing in 2017-18 is 49.9 billion, 8.4 billion lower than forecast at spring budget. Why? Because receipts are higher, more money is coming in, and that is indicative of the economy strengthening. And the page following indicates spending decisions and tax decisions that have been taken in the budget. But I do, Mr. Speaker, have a very specific question for the Treasury bench in relation to the Red Book, which may have been raised by my honourable friend, the member for Dover, but it is of considerable importance. On page 82 of the Red Book, and it's copied from, I think, page 114 of the ABR's book, in 2022-23, it is said that there will be a £3.5 billion own resources contribution to the European Union. Now, I cannot believe that those wise figures in the ABR or in Her Majesty's Treasury could have made a schoolboy error of just assuming that money paid out in 1 year would continue indefinitely. But it is missing the point that by 2022-23 we will have left the European Union, that the implementation period will have ended, the whole concept of own resources will have ceased to exist. And this is, I feel, rather like spotting an error in Wisden Cricketer's Almanac, something that it's very rare to do and indicates an occasional failing that I hope will be put right, and we will discover that this is not intended. Because if it is, it means we won't, in fact, be stopping our contributions to the European Union. And that would be very strange. And to have them described as own resources is even more peculiar, because that assumes that we are still members. So I think there is an error there. But I do think this ties in with the point made very elegantly earlier on by the honourable gentleman for Rees Mogg, that the key to this budget has to be Brexit. That what we are doing currently is in the context of leaving the European Union. Of course I give way to my right honourable friend.
I very much like to respond to the point that my honourable friend has just made on the subject of the forecasts. Those forecasts are made by the OBR. The OBR were provided with the Prime Minister's Florence speech, the basis on which we are negotiating with the EU, and it is up to them to make their own independent forecast. My understanding, and you will have to, the honourable gentleman will have to speak directly to the OBR about that, but they've used an average of other independent forecasts that have been prepared.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, but I don't think this quite works for the own resources figure, because they have made assumptions relating to our net contributions to the European Union, and they have assumed that those monies will be spent domestically in the United Kingdom, and that therefore there is no fiscal advantage. But there is still a 3.5 million negative income from own resources. Now, it's hard to think that the OBR would have taken that from other forecasters, because that is a matter directly understandable from the Treasury, that the Treasury can give an authoritative view on. And it would be very odd if the Treasury hasn't explained that own resources will end at the point at which we leave the European Union. It has to. Only member states of the European Union can make own resources contributions for very obvious reasons. Though I've always disliked the term own resources, I've always been with Margaret Thatcher, that it's our money and we'd quite like to keep it. Thank you very much. But I wanted to go back to the fundamental point that this budget is inevitably encompassed by Brexit and by productivity. And I think this is where the challenge is. The OBR has very gloomy forecasts on productivity, and these lead to a reduction in potential output in 2021-22 by 3%. And the challenge for the architects of our economic future is how do they make Brexit work to ensure that we get a productivity boost? And this is where I was so encouraged by what the Chancellor had to say, because he said this was going to be a free trade government. And this is the real opportunity that comes from Brexit. It is to open up our markets to the rest of the world freely. We have to remember that the customs union, which the honourable gentleman, the member for Nottingham East, is so keen to stay in, is actually a protectionist union that stops people in the United Kingdom buying the cheapest available goods and, by and large, protects industry that the UK does not have. The overwhelming majority of the protection under the customs union is for things like German coffee processors or Spanish orange growers, those types of things that we are not doing. Our industries receive very marginal protection from the customs union, but it is a very high cost to British consumers. It is thought that the cost of food is 20%, and the next highest level of tariffs comes on clothing and footwear. And the opportunity here for the poorest in our society to see their standard of living boost, their real wages rise, is really quite fundamental. That it will mean that their weekly, monthly, annual expenditure will be reduced, their real income will rise, and this will make available funds for other expenditures, or indeed for saving and reinvestment in British industry. But equally, it will mean that because we lose the cosy protectionism, we cease to subsidise continental inefficient businesses, we also ensure that we concentrate on what we are best at. And that ought to lead of itself to a boost in productivity, and indeed this is the lesson of history of when you move to free trade and the removal not only of formal tariffs, but also of non-tariff barriers. And this, Mr. Speaker, if things go correctly and the correct policies are adopted, is where the £350 million a week can ultimately be provided for the National Health Service. The figures produced by Professor Patrick Minford and his very distinguished team at Cardiff University indicate that there will be a boon of £135 billion between 2020 and 2025 and £40 billion a year after, which will be possible to have both tax cuts and make it possible to fund the health service. And it's very encouraging to see that the Chancellor has already begun this process and is making more money available for the health service at this stage, because I think it's important that politicians deliver on the spirit of their promises as well as on the detailed, pettifogging, nitpicking, small print element of their promises. So I think it is right that that should be made possible, and having a free trade development of economic policy is going to be crucial to that, and it's very welcome that the Chancellor has put this in his budget speech today. The other thing that is, of course, of greatest issue and importance to our voters is the issue of housing. And here I would encourage the Chancellor to go further. I think it is absolutely right that we have more house building. It is absolutely right that the government is supporting that. But the key to it is going to be reform of the planning system. The thing that makes housing so expensive in this country is that supply is controlled. As the Chancellor rightly said in his budget speech, actions to help demand are merely likely to put prices up. And what we need is to see prices, at least in relation to incomes, come down, and that means increasing supply, and to increase supply in a way that people want to live. And therefore the one question I would raise on the budget, Mr. Speaker, is that the Chancellor said he would look to ensure that the housing was primarily in an urban setting. But actually, when you ask people what housing do they want to live in, they say 80% of people say they want to live in houses with gardens. And this means we are going to have to build on green fields, and it would be wise to review the green belt, because there are some areas of it that are not actually essential to life and the pursuit of happiness. What we really want, Mr. Speaker, I think, is a whole succession of Poundbury's across the country, because that's what people want to live in, and I think the Conservative Party should be on the side not only of the Prince of Wales, but also of the people.